I'd like to welcome you to the place. This is the place for intellectual, spiritual, and scriptural honesty, whatever that means. We're not claiming to be honest. We are attempting to be. We're not suggesting that Scripture is the best term to call ancient manuscripts, nor are we claiming to be spiritual. We're just looking at these terms and how they have been used throughout history. However, we want to be as intellectually honest about it all tonight, and we're very, very happy to have P.Z. Myers on the show tonight. I think that he's an awesome individual. My wife and I have been watching various videos of him this week, and we are very impressed with his demeanor, his content, his ability, and his mind. And so we're so thankful to have you here tonight, PZ. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
You were fantastic on the last show, and we had lots and lots of emails, lots of text messages coming in, simply applauding everything that you had to say.
Okay, yeah, set the bar high. Make it really hard for me to keep going.
There you go. Okay, let me bring everyone else in here. My wife's to my right, Rhonda, and she's the most amazing woman in the world, and I just want to wish her again Happy Mother's Day. And for all of you guys
Thank
out
you.
there who are mothers, you can say Happy Mother's Day to them.
Right. On my show, I took care of the mother thing, but Happy Mother's Day again. And it's a special day for mothers. And so if it had not been for your mother, I guess we wouldn't be married. So, Mama, I'm thankful you gave birth to this right here to the left. Thank you.
That sounds good. Okay, we also have Greg Bray. He's a biologist and also an atheist. He's on our show tonight. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you for having me. I'm
And
excited.
also we have actually Professor Bob Graves. He's a linguist, and he's with us tonight. Welcome, Bob.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. Looking forward to it.
And to our left here in the studio, we have Michael Fulford and also Sean. Would you guys just say hello to PZ and everyone else?
Howdy. Hello, PZ. Nice to meet you.
Hello.
Michael Fulford is actually kind of an organizer of the, kind of of a meetup group of free thinkers. And and Sean has his own identity, if you want to say what that is.
The Christopher Hitchslap YouTube channel.
Yeah, he is right on YouTube, Christopher Hitchslap.
And both of these gentlemen are actually atheists. And so let's get started with the show. I asked you to come on because the last show we talked about the subject, is church harmful? And you gave an amazing answer. You simply said yes. Do you want to go back on that?
No, I still stand by that.
That's good, and we so appreciate that. What we'd like to do tonight is to examine the crucifixion, that is, its theology. And if you will, I want you to tell us your thoughts about this theology that so many people are talking about. I'm talking about a theology that says that God sent his son into the world to actually be beaten beyond recognition, to be tortured to death so everyone could be saved if they would believe in sweet Jesus. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it is possibly the worst idea anybody ever came up with. That this whole idea that you can have a sacrifice by proxy, an actual blood sacrifice, and that it somehow alleviates our burden of guilt. It does not. If anything, it should make it even worse that somebody has died for us and died to no avail. So, I find the whole idea horrifying. And then on top of that, of course, the other bizarre thing about this theology is the idea that not only did this Jesus fellow die, but he didn't really die because he came back 3 days later. And he was an immortal being all along. So it's kind of like a cheat. Not only do we have to believe that there's a sacrifice that saves us, but it wasn't really a sacrifice.
Greg, what are your thoughts on this?
I really couldn't have summed that up any better, but I have to say that the substitutionary atonement is only a portion of it, but I think it's a very, very significant portion that we need to recognize how incredibly harmful that idea can be, in just even thinking that it's possible to sacrifice something to substitute for your sins somewhere else, or your wrongs. I mean, I shouldn't use the word sins here, but I think it's silly, it's twisted, and it's extremely macabre. But beyond that, we also, I think, hopefully, if we're talking about the crucifixion tonight, should talk about a little bit if it even happened and if that matters. I think that there's certainly something to be said on the theology, but also just on the practicality of such a thing. And that's something I'm hoping we can touch on.
Bob, what are your thoughts?
I have many about it. One surprising experience I had was I used to be part of a group called the Center for Contemporary Spirituality, and we had a meeting in a public library once where someone brought up these issues, and about this angry God who's going to be beating his son to death. And what surprised me was that there was a Buddhist and a Jew on our panel, and we were all the three of us co-directors. The fellow who was the Buddhist expert, he actually started talking about Isaiah chapter 53 from a Jewish standpoint, and trying to express to the crowd an ability to at least empathize with that point of view. I was really surprised at how he made it sound like it made sense, even though it was something I'm sure he didn't even subscribe to. So that did make me feel like, there may be ways of seeing this that we might be dismissing, but at the same time, I share that idea that the whole concept that Jesus had to come and be just totally abused for the sake of appeasing a God in heaven, and that somehow this is sufficient to be vicariously an atonement for us, is to me, rejectable, and it's nonsense. So even though I am a theist, and even though I am a person who would a Jesuit of sort, that to me that it is a whole distortion of what really the text is even talking about. And of course, I think the text gets translated in a way that makes it seem like it's trying to uphold these traditional views, but it is a horrible model of spirituality for us to subscribe to, in my opinion.
What kind of harms come from actually teaching penal substitution, that is, in church life or possibly in a school, PZ?
Oh, well, it fosters a kind of peculiar way of thinking, doesn't it? That here you've done these horrible things. Apparently we have done things that have deeply offended a superpower in the sky who is really, really angry at us. And the way to get out of this is for us to kill somebody. Isn't that kind of warped right there? I mean, that we have this get out of jail free card that's built upon a framework of human suffering and sacrifice. There's so many things wrong with that. Not only the logic, but that it can lead to people believing that one way they can absolve themselves from great sin is simply by believing in this death.
Can I add something there, Dr. Strong?
Yeah, go for it, Bob.
I
Someone
see
turn
some
up.
of the other
Excuse me for a
harms,
minute. Can someone turn up the monitor, please? I'm having a hard time hearing everyone. Thank you. Go ahead, Bob.
One of the serious problems I see with this is the notion that punishment is an appropriate response to wrongdoing. I think our current prison system. We have a lot of people in this country who are absolutely opposed to doing anything that is really redemptive for people whose lives have turned in directions that are absolutely unacceptable. And for reasons we're not even interested in empathizing with. And so supposedly in the name of justice, we lock them up and do all sorts of things, and then we deny that we've actually sent them to crime tech to actually turn them into people who are going to come out of that place far worse than they went in. And I think that this is one of the ways in which our culture suffers because of this notion that it's even possible or appropriate to punish anybody, even punish the sinner. That punishment is just a vindictive, useless response. I'm not saying that we gotta overlook everything. We can't. But to me, that's one of the harms that comes to our society by accepting the notion that, I mean, after all, if God puts a stamp of approval on a vindictive punishment by punishing Jesus for everybody, then there can't be anything wrong with really that kind of approach to wrongdoing.
Right. You know, the other thing I feel about it is that what we're doing is punishment for crimes, for sins, whatever. There's a moral logic I can sympathize with, which is if you've got somebody who's done a horrible crime, you want to remove them from the culture so they don't do it any further, and hopefully you give them a place to go where they can think about what they've done wrong and maybe get turned around on this sort of thing. But the example of Jesus doesn't do any of that.
No.
It's this horrible murder that really accomplishes nothing for us. And I'd also like to point out the arrogance of this idea that this one Jewish prophet's sacrifice was so great that it redeems the entire world. Yet at the same time that Jesus was being killed, if he existed at all, thousands of people were being hung on crucifixes. That this is happening all over the world. That there have been horrible deaths. Why don't we look at a modern death and say, doesn't that redeem us? Why doesn't it?
You know, one of the things that I'm impressed with, and I have been, after watching many of your videos, that is your honesty. It seems like you're very, very compassionate for people. And in your tone here, it's just really overwhelming. And I'm speaking from the theistic standpoint because I want to be honest with you. Years ago, I used to think that all atheists were devils. I was taught to think that way. I no longer do. And so when I approach atheists, today it's a different thing. It's a different experience, and I find it to be ever so meaningful. And so let me ask you a couple of questions. Have you, about your journey, have you always been an atheist?
Oh, well, I think so, but I wasn't aware of it. I was never a believer, and so it was a gradual awakening to realize that, oh yes, this word that I hear out there, that's what I am. That fits me very well. So but I have never had any deep belief at all.
Most theists, when they approach you, do you feel like they're trying to get you saved?
Oh, it depends on which ones you're talking about. When I go to, I've actually been to church events here in my small town, usually because they've got a creationist on, and I'm there to take notes on what they're saying. But yes, I've often been approached in those contexts, and yeah, they are definitely being evangelical. They're out there trying to argue with me, telling me that I have to believe in Jesus or I'm going to go to hell, that sort of thing. But outside of those sorts of environments, when I encounter Christians, no, that's not usually the response. We've got other things to talk about, and it's not a major issue.
I also found that many people are trying to approach you with philosophical arguments, and I'm talking about theists, and instead of actually telling you how they tie it to their canon, quote-unquote, text, it seems like they can't. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes, there's there's a kind of dishonesty about that, where they come to me and they make these very abstract, very vague arguments about the possibility of a prime mover, for instance, something at the very beginning. Yet at the same time, what they're actually endorsing, when you actually ask them what they believe, it's this very specific, very peculiar theology of Jesus Christ and Christianity and all this sort of things. So there's a complete lack of connection there. There's an effort to simply get me to admit that, hey, maybe a God existed somewhere, sometime, of some sort, with no definition of its nature, and then they want to do a quick switch and substitute Jesus in there.
Do you find that most religions do the same thing? I mean, it seems like most religions have the same philosophical arguments, but they all tie it to different texts.
Yes. Well, the thing is, I've encountered exactly the same behavior from Muslims, so they've got that very same sort of fundamental background to them. The thing is, when I've met, for instance, Buddhists, no, the Buddhists are different, because I usually don't catch them in the environment where they're reciting a dogma or going along with a particular ritual or anything. It's more, here's this vague belief, here's what I believe, is it okay with you, do you think that's reasonable? And I say, okay, sure, go ahead, believe whatever you want. But they avoid giving me those concrete examples that Christians are so ready to throw at me.
Well, PZ, do you believe that, and from an earlier statement, I'm thinking you possibly do not, but I want to clarify it. Do you believe that Jesus is an historical figure?
Oh, what do you mean by a historical figure?
Well,
There's no contemporary documents left of his life. There's nothing left of Jesus except for some stories that were written down many years after his execution, if he existed at all. So he's partly in the realm of legend. I have no problem with believing that there were Jewish mystics wandering around the Middle East saying things similar to what is attributed to Jesus. And I have no problem believing that Romans executed some of them. But pinning it down to one particular guy, there's nothing there. It's not like we have a birth certificate for some guy or a tombstone or something where you can say, oh, this is the fellow who lived at that time. Let's start sorting out what was real and what was mythical about him. It's more like Robin Hood than anything else.
Greg, did you have any comments to make at this point?
Yeah, actually, I'm watching the Ustream chat stream here, and there's somebody who's asking a question that I think is really important. It's why did Jesus die? I mean, let's assume that the story is historical and say that it happened. It happened for a reason, according to the theology, and that reason was that we are all, to go a little bit Calvinist on this one, we are all absolutely depraved. We are absolutely worthy of eternal torture and hellfire, or even just absolute decimation and annihilation, when we could live in eternal glory with some God. And this is all because God has arbitrarily chosen to pass the sin down from some guy in a garden before he even knew or had the knowledge of good and evil. I mean, this is what the myth is all a construct to answer the problem that was created by that. They needed a savior to come because there was already the assumption that we were all completely evil and worthy of God's wrath. So I think if we couch this question of what does the crucifixion mean in understanding what the crucifixion was here to answer, we can really recognize a lot more of where the harmful nature of this comes in. Because even if we disregard the substitutionary atonement and just say that he fulfilled the covenant so that it released us from those bonds that were there, and in that way allowed us to be free, I guess. I can't articulate their arguments that great, but I will say that we still have to recognize that it's teaching that, I mean, even the sinner's prayer and all of these things it's teaching everybody from the moment they're children. I mean, I went to a church today. I went to a baptism for my friend's daughter. My wife was the godmother. And they said the sinner's prayer and talked about depravity and about how this sprinkling of water is washing away the sin that this infant was born with. And it's just absurd, and it's horrible to think. Imagine the people who have lost children and have been taught this and have, for some reason or another, not been able to baptize their child. They now believe that perfectly innocent little infant is burning in hell somewhere because of some crazy original sin story.
The other side of this too, though, is that when I hear the story of Jesus, what I think of is things like Harold Camping. Okay, I think it's a perfect example of the same phenomenon. What I think happened, 2,000 years ago, was that there was this very popular cult leader. Maybe he was a wise guy, maybe he was saying good things, maybe he was a wonderful person, and he was executed, and his followers went into shock. Okay, this is not what was expected, that their great good leader would suddenly die. And so this entire story of horrible sin and redemption by his death is a rationalization by the people of that first century Judea trying to explain what could have happened to them, just as there are so many excuses that the followers of Harold Camping made.
And don't you think, though, it would fit in well with the previous Jewish traditions, though, of their atonement of the animal, that in a sense this was a springboarded view that may have added itself to that?
Yes, that what happened is that here's this very grim Jewish tradition, because the Jews at that time had been kicked around there, all over the world just by people. Had no homeland. Well, they had one then, but they were constantly getting displaced, and they were struggling to rationalize that. And out of that rather dismal, cynical sort of culture of the time, you get this horrible event. And of course, what you do is you invent this gruesome story of horror and death that you use to explain what happened. There's so many different ways they could have explained this, that could have been all sweetness and light, but instead we've got this tale of horror and grim death forever, and children being born in depravity and things like this. It came out of the culture, that's for sure.
Yeah. I noticed that there was a comment on the chat portion of the Ustream broadcast. Someone said, so then why did Jesus die? And the only answer I can come up with was he was evidently disturbing the status quo so badly that he was murdered.
Mm-hmm. I can believe that.
Right. That's exactly what we teach. And one thing I have a problem with is Christianity. To me, they are huge hypocrites because they really dog the pagans. They believe in this and that, but yet we have one of the greatest human sacrifice stories of all times, and it seems very hypocritical to me to really treasure and worship this human sacrifice story, and yet we condemn the pagans for their actions, and I think that's horrible.
Yes.
That's true. The pagans offered up human sacrifices all the time, and it's like this story simply borrows or plagiarizes it from paganism. That's quite clear. I agree with you, PZ, that it was probably true that Jesus was walking, possibly telling some powerful stories, like things like love your neighbors and your enemies, wonderful things. He certainly was getting in trouble, that is, with the Jews, because he was renouncing the very concepts of Judaism and its very premise. And so it's probably true that he was simply murdered, and then his disciples were shocked because they had very much a theology that their Messiah would rule and reign, and they would actually have restoration back to Israel. Going to Greg's point, Greg was trying to bring up an idea as to why Jesus was crucified. And I think that you wanted to look through the eyes of Calvinists. Is that correct, Greg?
Well, really, anybody who is arguing for substitutionary atonement is obviously substituting Jesus because we deserve this. I mean, that's the argument, is that there's two sides to this. One, if Jesus didn't die, I mean, it's very important to traditional Christianity that Jesus is a historical person, really did die, because if not, this entire theology is based on a myth. And the other side of it is if, and this is the more fundamentalist side, but if Adam and Eve was not a literal story, or if at least on the less fundamentalist side, there's not a true original sin, or we're not all living in sin, then the whole death of Jesus was irrelevant in the first place. So it really, Jesus is the answer to the problem of sin that was created by the Jewish people of the time. Again, regardless of whether he really was a person who spoke some of these things or not, it's a complete fabrication could have been done in such a way that you have a problem and you have a solution, and that solution is killing him to atone for all these sins, and now we have an answer for down the road. So we need to look at both sides of this, not only what the crucifixion stands for itself, but what the role of the crucifixion is according to this theology, that we should really recognize is also just as horrific.
Well, the premise, let's go back to the premise. And I think that most of us here will agree that it's ridiculous. God has two children, Adam and Eve, and he says, go out in the backyard and do anything that you want to, but don't eat of one particular tree. And so they wind up talking to a talking snake and a walking snake, and they eat a piece of fruit, and they're cursed forever. Not just them, but their children, grandchildren, etc. And so the theology of the wages of sin is death comes from the first Adam, and I think you would agree if you've studied anything that is in the Christian faith. This is why the Apostle Paul, when we read in the book of Romans, he's actually contesting that fabric of Judaism by this statement, or these statements. He says, there is no one righteous, no, not one. There is no one who understands, that is God, no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have altogether become worthless. And so what Paul is saying is Judaism, that is the religion that he was raised in, it actually stated that you were not righteous, you were not good, you couldn't understand God, you couldn't seek God, you've turned away from God, you've become worthless. And so I think that's where Christians are coming from. They think that everyone is in that particular paradigm. And
they think that Christians, they think that Paul is quoting the Old Testament to confirm it rather than to confront it.
Exactly. And so Christians are saying, wow, Paul is quoting the Old Testament, that is the Jewish tradition, and he's trying to say, listen, you need a Savior to get out of this. And the opposite is true in the read if we look at the Greek, but the English is very much in disagreement with the Greek text, but that's a superfluous point. But my point is, why are so many people believing in the crucifixion? I think it has to do with the meta-language, a very failed meta-language that we find in what we call translations. And so when we discuss the crucifixion in English from these meta-languages, I think we're finding that Jesus needed to be sacrificed in order to take away the sins, because according to these English Bibles, we are what? Dead in our transgressions. And because we are dead in our transgressions, we need to have sweet Jesus somehow save us. I don't believe any of it, but that's, I think, the basis for it.
Can I add one more thing here?
Yes.
That I have found that when it comes to people who are traditionally religious, that they do come in varying degrees of thinking it through. Some people subscribe to some of these traditional beliefs, and then when it comes to living their lives, they just do what makes sense to them without considering whether or not how they live or think is in any manner discordant with their traditions. Other people take these traditions very seriously and try to apply it. I'm thinking back to this baptism that Greg went to, and how this would apply. When you're a parent and you have a child, and this child begins demonstrating behavior that you know you need to somehow redirect or guide, if you believe and take to heart, oh, the reason why this child is behaving in this way is because they're a sinner. The attitude that this brings out in you and the perspective that you have towards that child, I think is going to be extremely destructive to their well-being. And instead of seeing the child as someone who, every child comes into the world knowing only that they exist, and the discovery that there's someone called mom or whatever, and learning to appreciate what it means to be conscious of one's own existence and not aware of what other people are thinking. This process of becoming an adult where you can live as one among many is a developmental process that we need to learn how to deal with, learn how to negotiate, instead of something where when we violate other people from naivete, this isn't because of sin, it's a developmental problem. And I think that we look at the entire challenge of raising a child very differently. We're trying to guide them into an awareness they were not born into, but that except that they're born into the world, and we're explaining this process away, totally dismissing it by just explaining that their behavior is attributed to the fact that they're just sinners. To me, depending to the degree that a family would take that to heart, that belief, it becomes child abuse.
I agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
PZ, what are your thoughts?
Well, when I hear these stories, what I think of is you've ever heard of somebody who tells a lie, some elaborate lie that then people check up on, and you got to keep adding to the lie, and you got to cover your tracks, you got to deal with the contradictions, you got to build it up. And what you end up with is this elaborate interlocking network of stories that individually are kind of improbable, but you need them all to hang together in order to make the big lie work. And I think that's what we're seeing in Christianity, is these interlocking lies that build up a theology. And now at this point, nobody can go back on any one piece of it, because if you do, if you knock out one little piece of it, the whole edifice falls apart, and it becomes obvious that it's all nonsense. Ken Ham at Answers in Genesis makes this claim himself that if the earth is more than 10,000 years old, if it's millions of years old, then that negates Genesis, which means that the death of Jesus is meaningless, and the whole Bible falls to pieces. That's the way these lies work. So that's what I hear every time we hear these efforts to justify these religious beliefs is, oh man, you are struggling so hard to keep this lie alive. It's really sad.
Although I would think that they've turned it into a package deal that it doesn't really have to be. I have no problem regarding the text as just a bunch of human words as they're trying to make sense out of from a very immature standpoint of the human race, and to see spirituality as something that we are all developing a sensitivity towards, and what have you. But the way that a fundamentalist mindset has put it together, it has become a total package that cannot be compromised at any point.
Right, and that means that they have to stick with stuff that's nonsensical. For instance, some of them adhere to this idea that the earth is 6,000 years old, which is absurd on the face of it, completely contradicted by the evidence. But because they've got that total package idea, it's all got to be tied together, it's all got to be locked into place, they can't even let that go.
Yeah.
They're trapped in the big lie.
That's true.
That is true.
That is true.
They have a much better chance if they do it a la carte. Pick and choose.
That
And
is
then
true.
they turn that into a pejorative, you're a cafeteria Catholic or whatever.
Right.
Picking and choosing is supposedly a terrible thing. But when you're dealing with a mishmash of fuzzy legends, I think that's the only thing you can do is what makes sense in the world, what makes sense with my objective reality, what fits with my life. Let's put this together into a story.
I want to read you another passage because I want you to react to this, and I want you guys to keep PZ's face on the screen as I read this because I want to see how he reacts to this.
Uh-oh.
Now, this is one of these verses that's often told to atheists.
I hope it's like a proverb or a psalm.
Well, it's not a proverb. It's actually, to be honest, this is so Calvinistic, it's unreal. But this is often told to atheists. This is the reason that you can't believe in God. This verse is read. It's found in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 14. The man without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually discerned. What is your reaction?
I agree completely with that. I actually do. Because spirituality is nonsense. It's Jabberwocky as far as I'm concerned. So telling me that I don't understand Jabberwocky and therefore I can't appreciate Jabberwocky is true. You have to show me something evidential, something material, something real that I can recognize, and then maybe I'll agree with it.
That's good. That's good. We don't want to go further in the show without looking at Vince Laria's work, and he's working behind us, PZ, actually doing some artwork in the studio, reconfiguring our studio as we speak, and so he's taking.
Right?
Do what? Yeah, and he's an atheist, by the way. We have all these atheists in
Very talented atheists.
our studio. He's doing a wonderful job. Would you like to say, get a shout out to PZ?
Sure. Hey, PC.
Come on over here, Vince. Now, this is Vince. He's a wonderful person. Just get down here in the camera if you would.
Squat down, like we say in the South.
Okay.
Yeah, he's really doing a great mural.
I'm glad I have two sides of my brain because I've been listening to the conversation with one side and painting with the other.
So the rational side is listening and interpreting, and the artistic side is expressing itself. I hope that's the way it's working.
Yeah, I'm putting as much detail into my work as I'm getting from you, detail into the atheist point of view. Which is mind-boggling. It's really involved and enlightening. This thing of the constant lie, I've never even thought of that as a lie. Because I used to be a liar when I was a teenager, you know.
I think every teenager was a liar.
Well, yeah.
I remember starting a little fire with leaves in the window well of our basement. You know, where there's a window into the basement down to ground level, and I was playing with matches, and I said, he said, "Were you playing with matches?" When I ran up the stairs to see my dad, you know, I said, "No." He said, "You know, when you lie, it's written all over your face." Well, guess what? It's written all over history, too.
That's a good point, Vince.
Yeah, he deserves a round of applause. He's a wonderful person. Let's move a little bit further down the road in this discussion. I want to get our two panelists tonight involved in the discussion. Would you guys like to make a comment about what PZ is saying or ask a question?
Well, I don't really have a question, but when it comes to the whole sacrificial theology thing, is someone made a point a while back, and I saw this through Facebook, that the entire point is that God sacrificed himself to himself in order to forgive humanity for the sins that he created to hold them to, that he then, you know, like you were saying, here's this apple, or whatever the fruit is, people use apple, here's this apple, don't eat it, it's right in front of you, don't touch it. I'm going to turn my back now and walk away, but don't touch it. You touched it. That works real well with kids, I've found. If you tell them not to touch something and then leave the room. Yeah.
Yeah, I know you're being sarcastic.
So it does kind of make and God's omnipotent. Okay. And omniscient, and he didn't see that coming.
It's amazing. Sean.
I would say I'm kind of taking on board this new theory about what Jesus did, which is basically relating it to the suicide by cop type scenario where Jesus orchestrated, he pretty much ensured that he was going to be murdered by the Romans. And I see it as the true victims of the whole shenanigans that happened are, well, Judas for committing suicide, for turning him over to the Roman authorities, and the Jews for hundreds of years after being accused of sacrificing the Savior. So when I say suicide by cop, I mean that he did nothing. As a matter of fact, he provoked a response that left a huge trail of victims behind it. And I'm just assuming for the second that the story is true. The real victims in it are the people who were drug into this orchestrated, in my opinion, soap opera that forced the hands, because he had many chances to get out of this crucifixion, but he absolutely refused to stand up and do any miracles. He had no problems when it was time to convert people, but when it was time to save himself, no, he did nothing. So that's kind of my take on it. I think I'm not 100% on it, but it's interesting to look at it from that perspective.
PZ, why do you think that the disciples didn't defend Jesus there at the end?
I don't know. I mean, were they even there? There's so much of this story that doesn't make sense. And as I mentioned earlier, it was all written down many years after the death. Do we even know that account in the Gospels is in any way accurate? I don't know that I believe it. So that's one issue there.
Certainly. Let's pretend for a moment, like we do in Christianity. And I'm certainly not a Christian, okay? I'm very much a person who actually believes that if there's any veracity to anything that is within this read, it would be certainly about Jesus. But that's a side point. But dealing with the meta-language that we have here before us tonight, let's simply talk about what is there in our English reads. It says that he was beaten beyond recognition. And from many historical accounts, his head possibly was swollen twice the size. Now, that may be lots of hyperbole. I don't know. I'm not a biologist. But my point is, he picks up the cross, and this is actually staru. It's not actually technically a cross. It's simply a cross member that will be attached to a torture stake. And so the weight would be approximately about 200 pounds. So could an individual, after being beaten beyond recognition, pick up a cross member and carry it for about 3 to 4 miles?
Well, we don't know. We know nothing about this Jesus fellow. Maybe he was a really tough dude.
Well,
and then sure, maybe that's possible. We don't know the actual literal magnitude of the abuse that he received. So, this is going so far off into the hypothetical that
Well, I'm simply asking you to pretend with me for a moment.
Right.
Based upon all the stories in Christianity, because Christians want to present Jesus as one beaten beyond recognition. In other words, one beaten almost to death. And yet he's like Superman. He picks up the cross member and he walks a long way, and then he can't carry it any longer, and someone steps in. It's very, it's made for theater. In other words, I agree with that.
Right.
But he finally makes it to the cross, and he's on the cross. And if anyone has ever studied what happens, that is, when you are in that hanging position, you have to push up in order to breathe. And so, would it be possible physiologically speaking, to go through all of that? And I like your answer. It depends on, how well conditioned he was, I guess.
Well, yeah, I think it's very possible. Obviously I believe that he was murdered on the cross, and we do have non-believers who wrote accounts of this crucifixion story and of him, afterwards. So we have a believer's perspective in the Gospels, and then we have non-believers writing as well. I'm not saying that they couldn't have, been high or whatever, or made it up, but that's a fact. Beaten beyond recognition. If you've ever watched, this is kind of crazy, but you ever watch those ER shows when the man comes in with like the nail gun, about 10 nails in his head, and he drove himself to the hospital. I mean, people can do some crazy things, in dire conditions. So, yeah, I think it's very possible.
Well, they sorry to interrupt, but they actually tried that, the cross as we know it. They took a perfectly healthy person and, to see if he could actually carry this cross for any given length. And this was a very fit person. They weren't able to do it. If the cross is, how most people envision it, I think he got maybe a mile with it, and that's it. He just didn't have the strength anymore to move it. So being beaten beyond recognition and doing it that'd be a little tough to make it even harder to
Yeah.
do.
Well, I mean,
it
his,
is incredulous, but I would also wonder, sometimes what people do when they've been beaten and the amount of adrenaline that's going
Sure.
on, who knows what's possible in that situation. But it strikes me as interestingly hyperbolic, the way it's described. In fact, one of the things I thought was weird, when I went to see the movie that Mel Gibson put together, there's one moment in that movie that struck me as being an explanation for that, and yet so out of place. So when Jesus is being beaten, he's knocked down a few times, but then there's this one moment where, in spite of everything that's happening to him, he stands up and stands tall, and it struck me as being uncharacteristically defiant for the rest of it. And there's a sense in which there's this super ability for him to do what he did in getting to Golgotha after the beating that, I can't help but feel that there may be exaggeration to the beating, exaggeration to the distance, exaggerating to the fact that he carried it alone, as it were. And so it does strike me as a part of this event that is getting reported to us having been embellished a bit.
Yeah, I would make 2 points here, actually. One is that, yeah, there's amazing things that people can accomplish, and I would compare Jesus to Rasputin in this case, right? We all know about Rasputin's death. He was shot, he was poisoned, he was bludgeoned, he was knifed, and he kept on going, and they finally had to drown the guy. So, yeah, sometimes people can do remarkable feats and accomplish quite a bit. However, this is a story written by people promoting a religion many years after the death of their hero figure. And of course, what they do is chronically, consistently exaggerate everything. There's nothing heroic about talking about your savior who was able to lift 25 pounds and haul it a mile. Whoop-de-doo. So I'm sure that crossbeam has been getting bigger and bigger and heavier and denser over the ages.
I'd like to make a comment as well, specifically to Rhonda. You talked about the accounts of Jesus' crucifixion coming from non-believers and secular sources. I don't, I guess, think that we should get too much into the historicity of it, but I feel that it's always necessary to confront claims that are not particularly factual. There's only, as far as I'm aware, 2 accounts of Jesus at all that come from secular sources or non-Jewish / Christian sources, and they basically they're tiny mentions of it. First of all, and second of all, they confirmed that there were people that believed this happened. They're not eyewitness accounts or any sort of primary documents, just historians cataloging what the people of the group that were being called the Christians believed at the time. So I don't want to necessarily derail the topic too much, but I just really felt that it's necessary to address that statement.
Yeah, do you remember who the ones that you're referencing are?
I know Josephus is one of them, but I forget. Pliny
Tacitus.
the Younger, I think.
I think Tacitus was the other one.
Yeah, and there's one I think is I'm probably saying it really screwed up, but like Slinty the Third or something like that, or Slanty the Third. There were about 5 of them that when I was doing some research on this, and it is true, I didn't read the actual verbiage or whatever. I just noted that there were 5 unbelievers who made historical references to the crucifixion in some way and to Jesus himself.
But they were not contemporaries, right? They were distant in time from this event, just reporting that certain people believed in it.
Well, actually, I think that there's, when it comes to the historical studies, there's a lot of hoaxing that has been done to,
Right.
As they're copied by the Christian monks or the Christians later on. They tried to create historical evidence for Jesus later on, and it makes it very difficult. Like Greg mentioned Josephus, there's 2 parts of Josephus' testimony that come up. One is definitely faked, and the other, I think the general consensus is it is a real statement that people were worshiping Christ, that they were around. But even that's somewhat contested by scholars, so I'm not sure how much we really have in that respect of evidence for the historical Jesus and that, from
Unfortunately, though, also when it comes to any event
Yeah.
of history back then, actual contemporary historical verifications for many things just simply don't exist because the technology really didn't allow for it. So it becomes an interesting point, and it certainly becomes, I think, a point that says, well, then there's a lot of room for fudging.
Yeah.
But at the same time, in all fairness, when it comes to the historicity of a great number of events, a lot of these things are very, very difficult to nail down in terms of exactly how reliable they are. And there's almost this assumption that since the mentions that we do have exist, something happened to cause these mentions to happen anyway.
Right. I believe that.
Yeah, well, the thing was like with the Jesus story, we know that there was someone named Pontius Pilate who was in charge. Wish I'd looked this up before getting on here. But as I recall, the dates don't match up. The position he held would have been different at the time Jesus was supposed to have been crucified. Herod would not have been king at the time that he was supposed to have been in the New Testament. And to me, looking at it, you end up with an account that seems to have been, we kind of fudge details to make a good story much later after the event.
That sounds like American history, too.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
Well, everybody.
It's like history as a practice.
Yeah, history is a lot of history is propaganda. It's his story, as they put it, yeah.
Let me go out on the line here for a moment. I've been hearing lots of things about hyperbole, things made up. If you do examine the text itself, one of the things that we find that is impressive about the text is that you do find language flux that's very consistent with a particular time that's early on in the 1st century, that is about midway. And so the question would be, if you separate that language flux from the other language flux that has entered these various documents and you separate it, you're going to get a much different story. And so my question to you, for those of you who want to say all of this is bogus, it's just made up, it's fabricated, have you ever looked at it from that standpoint and separated that which has been verified as the language flux, that is, the middle part of the 1st century, as opposed to that which was actually put together much, much, much later and put together by copyists and put together in a very, very different way, syntagmatically, etc.
No, and I haven't, but I'd be willing to. I mean, I myself have only so much access to resources, not being
Because
a
what
educator.
you're dealing with, technically, you're dealing with unshielded manuscripts. And when you're looking at unshielded manuscripts, it's real easy to make mistakes. And we have better paleontographers today that are looking into some issues, and they can see that there is lots and lots of insertion. And you can see lots of tampering.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also see some consistencies, that is, within the text itself. And then you can see the modifications. When you take away the modifications, all of the tampering, and you look at that which is actually veracious to a first century document in that kind of language flux, you don't get into the hyperbole that we're talking about now. And I think Bob Graves would agree with me. Christianity is one thing, and actually what people were actually trying or attempting to say in the first century, that's something quite different. I don't think...
You know, a clear example that even an English reader can pick up on, in my opinion, is found in the letter of 1 Corinthians, chapter 14. The language flux there radically changes at verse 34 and verse 35. And if you read that section of the text and omit those verses, you find something where the flux maintains itself. But when you insert 34 and 35, it really takes a turn. And it's interesting to note that although verses 34 and 35 do exist in every extant manuscript that we have of 1 Corinthians, those two verses actually appear in 3 different places. And if you read it by removing them and putting them in, you can begin to see how those verses alter the flow of the text in a way very different from, say, omitting any of the other sentences. And that can be a way in which a person who's not necessarily a linguist could take a look at the text and see something that possesses a flux evidence of insertion. And that's the section, of course, that talks about how women should remain silent in the churches and they're not allowed to speak. Which is something Paul evidently forgot to mention.
You know, something that's quite simple to do is to simply look at the anaphoric and the cataphorics, and you can establish, you know, that which is much differently. And so, you know, looking at the syntax, you can see that it's some things are pure and some things are not. And so my point is, most of the discussion today is based upon minuscule manuscripts, which are very much an interpretation and very much have been in the context of hyperbole. And so, you know, most of the stories, and this is the crippling thing, I think, PZ, is when you're talking to theists, and I have a problem talking to theists most of the time because they don't want to be honest with the text. They will claim, oh, we have all the indexical and deictic elements necessary to understand the text. I claim that we don't. We only have bits and pieces, and so that's all we have to work with. But let's be honest about what's there and what isn't there. And it's difficult to get theists to be honest with it. And I think sometimes it's even difficult to get atheists to be honest with it also. Would you agree with that?
The problem I'm having right now is that we're looking at this document in 2 different ways. That as you're describing it, I could see that this is a reasonable approach to take to analyzing a historical document. And I agree completely, the Bible is a historical document that reflects the people, the culture that put it down, that wrote it, that shaped it and changed it over the years. And that's one approach. That's a historical approach. But then there is the other thing about the Bible, which is that people claim there is a kernel of spiritual truth to it, that there is something divine about it. And it doesn't matter how much historical analysis you do, that doesn't say a thing about the magical aspects that people claim for it.
Right, it's really just talking about the history of the text and trying to, it's a form
Right.
of textual
And if you're just talking
criticism.
about the history of the text, then you will not find atheists who are going to argue with you that, yeah, it was written in the middle of the 1st century, that it's been constantly modified and tweaked and changed over the years. If we have, if we have a classical interest in that sort of thing, we'd be very interested in looking at how a 2,000-year-old document changes, how it evolves over time. But that's a completely different question from what Christians are asking about. The devout fundamentalist evangelical Christians are asking about it. They're making this assertion that there is something divine at the core of it, that it is divinely inspired, that people wrote this under the influence of God and all these sorts of things. And, there's no way you're going to extract it, no matter how detailed you make your analysis. And there's also no reason to believe that it's true.
Well, I keep making this argument, and I will continue to do so until I hear someone who can convince me that it's not legitimate. For instance, for all of those who say all of this stuff was fabricated, it's simply a myth. We shouldn't even count it as anything worthy of looking into. I have various questions about this. And one would be, number one, these people were practicing a writing system, and it's called an abjad. And I've made many statements about what an abjad is. It's simply a consonantal text. Now, a consonantal text without vowels by the Jews, it was an intention by them simply to use this for a sense of creativity. Anyone could look at it and simply say whatever they wanted to about it, and it was fine. And this is what all of the Jews were raised with, something that was so ambiguous. You could simply spiritualize anything, and everything was fine. You could go A to Z, left or right, and everything was fine. But the New Testament wasn't written in Hebrew. It was actually written in Greek. And so the question would be, why would someone, if they're trying to fabricate something, why would they not stay with something that's highly ambiguous like an abjad instead of going into a writing system like Greek that's so accuracy-based? In other words, this is an accurate model. If they were trying to simply make up some bullshit, if you will, if they were trying to do that, why would they choose Greek to write in as opposed to writing in Hebrew and using the writing system called an abjad?
But wait. There's nothing intrinsic to Greek that makes it impossible to write bullshit in it. If there were, it'd be a wonderful language. I'd love to learn it then.
I'm not suggesting that it's not possible to write bullshit. I'm simply saying that the writing system itself demonstrates that they wanted to express clearly what they intended to state. And these people were not just in one location, they were dispersed, and we have documents. We have documents today, unsealed documents that have been dated and also placed geographically in different spots. And these people are testifying to various things that do have concert to them. And so my question is, if these people are trying to use an accuracy model of writing as opposed to their traditional system, would that not suggest something?
Wait a minute, though. I don't buy that argument either, because why would you assume that they chose the language to write in on the basis of some special quality of that particular language, other than its audience? That, that right now, for instance, most scientific writing is done in English. And I don't think it's because there's some mystical property of English that makes it particularly good for science writing. I think it's because we have this foundation of a large collection of papers, large literature written in this language, that there are many people who learn the language, so it's kind of a universal language to spread the information about. But it's not as if it's, I did not choose to write my science papers in English because I thought that was better than German.
Okay,
Dr. Jones,
okay,
could I respond to that?
Okay,
I
let
think-
me make my point first, Bob.
Yeah.
I want to ask PZ a particular question. Let's take your science papers and let's turn them into an abjad. Let's turn them into all consonants. Let's take out all equative verbs because this is a nominal structured language. Let's take out 10% of your transitives and intransitive verbs. And let me ask you a question. Do you think that your students or readers could really understand what you were writing?
Apparently, the people who wrote in that language could.
No, 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 no. The
You know,
The Jews have never stated that they could understand the writing system called an abjad. There was a writing system that was subsequent to that they could understand. An abjad was an intentional writing system that kept the author's intent ambiguous. And so that was the tradition of the sacred text. That is the text that we call the Old Covenant. And so if your intention is to keep things ambiguous, and then you move from ambiguity into something that's not ambiguous, a language of clarity. For instance, your science papers are wonderful with vowel points, but take out the vowel structure and what do you have?
Okay, let me try a metaphor that I can understand a little better. What if I took my science papers and instead of writing them in the plain English we do, we wrote them in a poetical form? We put them all into some kind of lyric or epic poetry or something,
Dr.
which would
Seuss, maybe.
right, which would
Yes.
it would make it harder to read. But the other thing about it is that it would require a different mindset to write. So, we can't
Right.
sort out the reasons why people switched from this abjad form to the Greek form, because it may be that it's because that's how these people were trained to think and write in their schools, as whenever they're trying to communicate some particular specific message, that the other form is what they were taught when they were trying to write poetry or something analogous.
Good. Dr. Jones.
Can I take a crack at this quick?
Yeah.
Bob
I
wanted to be up
just
next.
to-
Let's give Bob the platform right now because I interrupted him. Excuse me, Bob. Go for it.
Yeah. Two things. One is that I think part of the point you were making was not so much that Greek was the better language, but that Hebrew with an abjad was a language in which if one wanted to be pulling the wool over their eyes, they would have chosen that, and they didn't, so that the people who would have been intentionally trying to deceive could have picked a different way of talking about it that could have hidden their deception instead of speaking in a language where their deception would be far more clearly understood, being the koine, or the common language, the lingua franca of the empire. They would be writing things in a language everybody would at least be able to comprehend. The other thing I wanted to say is this, that Koine Greek died out in 330 the AD, which, although they continued copying manuscripts, nobody really spoke it or wrote it. And so after 330 AD, it would be difficult for somebody to mess with the Greek manuscript in order to try to change what it says, because they didn't read it. Nobody, there were 20 some odd active dialects of Greek that were different enough that people actually needed to speak either Koine or Attic in order to communicate with each other if they had different dialects of Greek. And when Koine died out, the language was lost even from people who would want to manipulate it. So whatever condition the text was in by the year 330 is pretty much the condition it was in, other than copyist errors, because until the year 1300, nobody even, they were working with the Latin Vulgate. They didn't care about what the Greek said.
That's true.
Well, but still, there's this premise here that there's a language that you choose because you're writing more clearly. The same English that we write our science papers in is the very same English that Deepak Chopra will pontificate this total nonsense in. This language is pretty darn good at spreading bullshit, and I suspect that that's true of any language. So, to argue that they've made this switch because they want clarity, I don't think that follows. I don't think you've demonstrated that.
Yeah.
I also-
No, it may
I
not.
think
It may
that
not. But
easy-
their natural language, their native language was Aramaic, and their
Uh-huh.
traditional spiritual language was Hebrew.
Well, just like many people now have a traditional language is completely different from English, but that's what they write in because that's the standard, that's where the audience is, that's what people are accustomed to reading a particular format.
Right. But don't you think
paper.
a fraud would prefer to avoid English?
No, because if the fraud is trying to defraud English-speaking people, they will choose English.
If I may,
But these writers, Matthew was not targeting Greek-speaking people. He was targeting his people there in Jerusalem. And so if you look at the content, these people were very much speaking to the Jews, and Paul was the one who was going to the Gentiles with the Greek. And so the point is, these people wanted that esoteric language that was very much flavored with all of their nuances, idioms, etc. And so I think that Bob is making a wonderful point that, if you're wanting to deceive someone, you certainly would stay with something that was extremely ambiguous. And so my point isn't to say that we have something that's so accurate we can all sit down and do the math to it. I'm simply bringing up a point, and sometimes I think the point is not even addressed. And so, Greg, you had a point. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but Bob did want to jump in quick.
A couple things I'd like to say. One, we have some viewers who are asking to get Sean and Mike's opinions as well. They'd like to get them a little more involved because they do like what you guys have to say. But two, I wanted to say that I think PZ brought up a fantastic point, saying Deepak Chopra, and also it's significant to consider that we're talking about these things as if the writers wanted to deceive people. Like the assumption that was their goal is not, I think, an assumption that we can make validly. In the same way that we can look at any cult that exists, even in modern day or in recent history. I've seen a meme on the internet that is one of my favorite things. It says, in a cult, there is a leader at the top that knows it's all a scam. In a religion, that person's dead. And I think that really speaks volumes to what's going on here, is that the people writing this may not have been trying to deceive things. They may have been fully convinced of everything that they were writing down. It's obvious that the people writing these down were not the people that were first. These were not eyewitness accounts of the actual people involved. These were members of the cult of Jesus. And the members of a cult, as we can all recognize, will spread the message of the cult to their last breath as they're sucking down that Kool-Aid, having no idea that it's a scam. So to say that the fact that they chose this language shows that they weren't trying to scam people, but sure, I have absolutely no problem recognizing the validity of that. But that doesn't mean that it's not based on a lie, a fabrication, or again, hyperbole, myth, any of the other ways that we can consider this. And to say that because there's anything of this nature that shows that they were being a little bit more authentic, or that they could have been more deceptive, somehow lends credence to the magical things that happen in the text, is quite the leap.
Okay,
Right.
I'm not.
And just
I'm
like
not,
today,
I'm
I
not
think
taking
most
that leap.
Christians are sincere and honestly believe in their faith, and that sincerity does not imply that they are accurate or true.
Okay,
Correct.
but the thing that I'm not arguing for, I'm not arguing, let's take the leap and believe all of it. That's not the leap that I want to take. I'm simply looking at this one step at a time. Would it be true that if you were trying to deceive people, you would stay with something that's ambiguous rather than something that's clear? That's my only point there. And I think that, after years of looking at the languages and the various documents, I think the disciples were clearly attempting to deceive people, and maybe it was just self-deception that they were into, but that's a side point. I was simply trying to make just only one point. You're moving from a writing system of ambiguity to something that's not. That's the only point that I was trying to establish, because we need to take steps and not make these leaps into other things. That was my point.
Well, wouldn't Joseph Smith have left all the Mormon documents in Reformed Egyptian if that was the case?
Wow.
He should have.
Matt, we haven't given you a chance to speak.
Good evening. Good to be here, Mr. PZ, Mr. Graves, Mr. Bray. Just to add on, I got a question on what you were just talking about. At the time, all the stuff, all the different translations embellished a lot of things, and you could tell it probably did, because the stories that we read now are completely unbelievable. And if they would have happened at the time, there would be more than 3 to 5 vague comments about the dead opening up out of their graves and being dancing in the streets with their loved ones and stuff like that, it would be obvious that there would be other accounts, major accounts, because that would be defying the laws of physics and everything else.
Yeah, someone should have written that down. Hey, today all the saints got out of their tombs and were praising Jesus, this guy we didn't know about before. We don't have that.
I agree. When it comes to the resurrection of Christ until the ascension, you have little to nothing stated. And that is just really, really strange.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, didn't Mark originally end at just the empty tomb?
Yes.
And then much later we start getting the accounts of Jesus appearing
Right.
before the disciples
Right.
and everything else.
Yes, that is true.
And so lots of this resurrection concept, the idea of the ascension, everything that happens in between, if there's ever a time that I would sit down and pin out something, it would be during that time. And we have very little, if anything, pinned during that time. Almost everything, if not everything, stated during that period of time is highly suspect, that is, textually speaking. And so you're bringing up a valuable point, yeah. But, this is the problem. Theists are not willing to be honest with their text. And so I think that we have to look at the text honestly. And then the second thing that we have to do is to say, can we believe the text? Let's talk about what it is, and let's, how can you tie it, into something that's legitimate? And then the next thing that you're going to have to do is to tie it to real people. We do not have an autographer. We have no original writing of no apostle. And so when people start talking about this is what Paul said or wrote or whatever, we have no ability yet to tie these writings to the Apostle Paul or John or Matthew or any of these people, yet they are. But they are done so in the sense of an iconic state. That's all.
If I were to walk down the street and run into John and Paul, I wouldn't know which one was which. So there's a sense in which who may have been the original author is, to me, in a sense, irrelevant. So the tradition doesn't speak to me, But at the same time, I think that I perceive the text much the way I would if I was a member of a jury, listening to testimony. I would not feel it responsible for me to believe every word of any given, person on the stand. And yet I could see how if I were to hear the testimony of 4 or 5 different people and they're different in their details, I would feel it fine and perfectly acceptable for me to extract from what they were saying the belief that they were talking about something, and I could make a decision as to whether or not the person attempted to be convicted here in this process may indeed be guilty. But I don't need to have evidence that is so incontrovertible that there's just no room for reasonable doubt. It's good enough that there's this testimony, and I don't take it any more seriously than that. These are the kinds of writings that were precipitated by things that happened. What actually happened? I don't know that I really know, but I think I can, from the testimony, discern the likelihood that certain things may have occurred in a particular way. That certain things were the message, and what have you. So,
PZ, when it comes to the morality of this story of the crucifixion, why is it true that every time that I ask a theist, is it moral to beat someone beyond recognition and torture them to death? Why do they claim that at that particular time in history it was moral?
Do they?
I mean, theists do all the time. I can't find, very few theists will ever admit that this is a horrible story.
And
they
at the
claim
same
that it's
time, they will
ethical
tell
and
us
just.
that there's an absolute God-given morality that we have to accept. It's clear evidence, I think, that their morality is highly relative. That 2,000 years ago, beating somebody to death was acceptable, torturing somebody was acceptable, executing them in the most horrible way possible is acceptable, holding slaves is acceptable. All things that I think we'd agree are not acceptable anymore. So what happened to that absolute morality? I guess it's gone.
Yeah,
Oh,
our
Vince.
painter wants to say something. Hold on, let me give him the microphone.
But what about Islam today? A lot of that is acceptable.
That's different cultures have different moral standards. Yeah, that's the case. And that we can have conflicts between these different cultures on the basis of their moral standards. I agree completely. I consider the Islamic moral standards, things like stoning women to death for adultery, as absolutely unacceptable in my culture, and I think it's unacceptable in any civilized human culture.
Thank you.
Right.
That's good.
That's for sure. I mean,
Can I ask you a few questions about evolution?
Oh, always, yes, that's my favorite topic.
Favorite topic. Okay, we've talked a lot about the crucifixion of Christ, etc. And please understand that my wife and I, we have renounced our salvation. We walked away from the concept of being born again and all of that. We don't believe that Jesus died for our sins and all of that. We're simply wanting to have a discussion for the purpose of trying to educate some theists, because theists are afraid to touch this. It's not just a sacred cow, but these people are so filled full of fear, they don't even want to approach the subject. And so I want to move on, because I think that your genius is in biology, and I want to take advantage of that tonight. If we can, just for a few minutes. Give me your best argument, and I'm a believer in evolution. Give me your best argument. Why should people think that the evolutional, that evolution is the best model out there?
Because if you're going to be consistent in your standards of accepting evidence, evolution is the explanation with the best natural evidence for it. That there is no evidence against it, that at this point there is so much evidence piled up in favor of evolution, it's basically a fact. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. The human species evolved roughly 100 to 200,000 years. Our particular human species evolved 100 to 200,000 years ago. All that has been documented both in the fossil record, the geological record, and in the modern molecular evidence. So in order to reject that, you have to throw away all of modern science in order to do so. That's a pretty hefty price to pay.
Sure. Hey, PZ, if I could ask you, if we were taking a look at, say, something like physics, we can talk about the fact of gravity. We can also talk about the theory of gravity. And as I would understand it, the fact of gravity is the observed realities that we can actually measure. We can even calculate the acceleration of an object being dropped towards another object based on what the atmosphere, all these other facts we can put together. So that there's a sense in which we can talk about the fact of gravity. We also have the theory of gravity, which tries to explain why the facts are what they are. Would I be incorrect in saying that the fact of evolution is, the fact that the species here today were not here in years gone by, and the species that were here in years gone by are not here now, and that evolution is a theory in terms of trying to explain these facts, but evolution is a fact in terms that this is what has happened. Now, am I necessarily wrong in calling evolution both a theory and a fact?
No, that's actually, there's actually a famous essay by Stephen Jay Gould which says exactly the same thing, that evolution is both a theory and a fact. So you're right in the mainstream there. Where I would quibble a little bit is where you draw the line, because just as with gravity, we've got all these mathematical formulae to describe exactly how something will behave as under the influence of gravity. We've also got these mathematical theory explanations that explain exactly how a gene pool, a population of organisms, will operate over time. And we can actually measure and test that in the same way that you can measure the rate that a ball is falling from the top of a building.
Right.
So we've got a pretty solid basis for saying that evolution is a fact. This is what populations do.
Yeah.
We can observe them in the modern world right now. We've got the historical record of what happened. It's the only possible way to explain everything right now.
I think the reason I bring this up too is because a lot of theists will inappropriately argue that evolution, well, it's just a theory, and
Yes.
and by doing that, they just dismiss the factual aspect of it. And I think it is science hasn't been perfect through the years, of course, but at the same time, I'm not aware of any time, particularly in modern history, where science is attempting to come up with theories that aren't already attempting to explain facts.
Yes.
I mean, there's
Well,
no
and
way that a
another part of that,
science
though,
field is going to
this
entertain
whole
a theory for which there's no facts to even suggest we need a theory.
Right. That part of that, though, is there's an additional point to that, and that is that when they say just a theory, it's a very strange thing to say, because a theory in science is an extremely powerful thing. When we say we've got a theory of something, what that's saying is we've got an overriding framework that can explain all of the facts, or the majority of the facts of the story.
Right.
And so to call something a theory is an extremely powerful and actually kind of flattering thing to say about it. We don't prefix theory with just. It's
Right.
not
You
just.
know, I think as a linguist, to me, it is they're mistaking the common usage of the word theory. I mean, like a detective trying to solve a crime might have a theory that a person is the guilty party, and now they're looking for the facts that will, establish a cause for arrest or something. Here, we're using the word theory in a very different way from the way a scientist uses the word, to the point where it's really a different word. And then the Christian oftentimes will swap these words back and act as if the scientist is using the word theory the same way the detective is.
Yeah, and it's odd they don't do that with, say, the atomic theory or the germ theory or other similar theories like that. It's only the theory of evolution.
Right, and this actually fits with something that was said earlier, because what they're doing is they're intentionally choosing a word that is ambiguous and confusing. Just like we were saying earlier about their choice of what language people are going to translate or tell their story in. This is a case where they've intentionally picked the bad word that has two meanings and that they can confuse people with.
Right.
Let me read something by Richard Dawkins. I want to see if you agree with it. He said, "Our minds are produced by brains, and our brains by evolution. Natural selection builds brains that are good at surviving, and brains that are good at surviving produce minds."
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I'd agree. What's unstated there is that the criteria for producing a mind that is good for surviving isn't necessarily a mind that is good at analyzing unusual phenomena, that is good at sorting out myth from truth.
Obviously.
Does science assume that the universe is rationally intelligible?
No, that's a result. That as we're analyzing the universe, when we see patterns that work, that actually accurately describe, then we can see that the universe is a universe of laws. If this were not a universe of laws, science would not work. We wouldn't be making any progress at all. It'd be total chaos. We'd never make sense of anything.
In your opinion, how did physical constants come into existence?
Oh, I'm not a physicist. There's a good book by Victor Stenger on this, though. Vic Stenger is a physicist who has written specifically about the cosmological constants. His particular position is that there's a lot of slop allowed in the cosmological constants, and that you could imagine that they arose simply by chance. That this particular pattern we've got now is a internally consistent, coherent pattern of rules. Because if there isn't an internally consistent, coherent pattern of rules, you don't get a universe, and that's why we're here, and why the universe behaves as it does.
Do you think that evolution will ever have an explanation that is of the origin of life?
Yes, they're working on it now. There's a number of good books on this subject too. Adam Rutherford just wrote one called Creation. There's another book by Hazen called Genesis. Notice they keep stealing from the Bible, these titles.
I keep saying that Jesus used fiction to defeat fiction and legend to defeat legend, and I think the atheists are copying Jesus.
Well, actually, it's
point.
really brilliant because they would get the Christian audience like Genesis. Oh, I'll buy it.
Oh, yeah, it's
Start
a
reading.
cultural
wonderful.
thing. We recognize these words. They have resonance. And
Right.
so
It's fabulous.
then we recognize those. But yeah, these are popular science books that describe the explanations there. There's some good basic chemistry. There's gaps, of course. We don't have the whole stepwise pattern of evolution, of chemical evolution. But we can see how it's going, and we can see where it's coming from.
PZ, I got a question for you. I'm certainly not a biologist, but as I read some of this stuff, there's some exciting things that I wonder about as possibilities. For one thing, it strikes me that DNA is, in a sense, a kind of language. And do you think that someday we'll actually, or a program, script, do you think that someday we'll actually decode the language and be able to actually see what the program is telling the biological material to do?
Well, yeah. I mean, we can do this right now.
Yeah.
People we can now sit down in a synthesizer, type in a sequence of A's, C's, T's, and G's, and get it built in a test tube, and then we can inject it into our organism of choice and get it incorporated into the genome.
Yeah.
So not only can we read the code, we can write to the code.
I saw something on one documentary on TV that I thought was fascinating, and of course I have no skills at verifying it, but I was curious if you knew about it. They were talking about how they had found the particular sequence that determined the shape of a spot on a butterfly wing, and they found that this same phrase, as it were, was also determining the shape of a lizard's eyebrow, and they had the same shape. I wasn't able to determine just how verify, but I was just wondering if there's things like that where the DNA even has phrases and sentences, as it were, that operate to speak in some coherent manner with the biology.
Well, yes. Come take one of my courses. I'll explain it to you.
Oh, that'd be awesome. I'd love it.
It's more abstract than you think. I mean, I know what molecule you're thinking of in the butterfly wing, and what it is a signaling molecule that radiates out, and it's chemical diffusion, it's interactions with receptors on other cells in its neighborhood that determine this pattern on there. And it's not like there is anything in the genome that says make a spot. What it says is make a protein with these particular characteristics in response to other proteins with these other characteristics, and then they all get assembled in the cytoplasm into the behavior of the cell. Everything that comes out of that genome is an emergent property. There's nothing that you can just read the DNA and compute the organism out of it. So it's sort of a one-way code. In order to read it, you have to actually express it in an organism.
We are
So it's a
being flooded
contextual
by
response.
we are being flooded by questions, and Joey just pointed that out. I have not been looking at my cell phone, and so I apologize to all of you guys who have been writing comments and actually sending in questions. But Matt had a question or a comment for PZ.
Well, I did. The evolution of religion. The thing about evolution is everything eventually goes extinct. That's as far as what we know. Religions, especially Christianity, has evolved a lot over the last 2,000 years, but especially the last 10 years. But it seems like right now, you'd think the normal progress would be like Dr. Jones and Professor Graves. Their type of philosophy would be the next step that Christianity or religion, spirituality would take. But there's been all of a sudden pushback to almost go back to a more orthodox type of religion. I'm wondering your ideas on that, why that's happening, and especially in the U.S.
Well, yeah, evolution doesn't predict what's going to happen. Evolution just says that local populations will adapt to local conditions. That's all it cares about. So as conditions change, the evolutionary forces are also changing. So For example, right now we're seeing the renaissance of atheism, where it's starting to grow. But as it's growing, it's also changing the culture around it. One of the common things we see with many atheists is that as they get into a more secular culture, they begin to take less interest in atheism, which is natural and reasonable, and I fully agree with it. So what that means is that for instance, as if atheist starts to win and take over the culture, we also see at the same time we're creating an environment in which our own atheist subculture becomes less fit and fades away. There'll be an interesting little seesaw going on, I think.
We have a question from Ustream. The gentleman's name is Christian Luke. He's a very intelligent young man. He says, how can the universe necessarily be consistent when our system of arithmetic was shown by Kurt Gödel to be incomplete and inconsistent because of the axioms, postulates taken to be true?
And what's the objection there? That what that's saying is that our understanding is incomplete. That what we do not have is a formal method of describing the entirety of the universe, which does not contradict the possibility that the universe is a coherent system.
Greg Bray, I haven't heard from you. Jump in.
I haven't had that much to contribute, to be honest. I mean, I think that you guys have been doing a wonderful job in tearing through this one. So I will say there was another slight objection. This one actually went to PZ from Christian. I was watching the stream, and I thought it too, in saying that there's no assumption that we need to make that the universe is consistent, that's an observation. I on a philosophical level, have to disagree to some extent and say that there are assumptions that we need to make to be, axioms we need to accept to be even capable of functioning, but they all have to be rather self-evident and unprovable, as it were. So, the consistency of the universe is something that we have to assume before we can observe it by our observation. It's sort of self-affirming in that respect. But
so give me an example of an axiom that we have to accept.
Well,
one is that the universe
I would
is
even say that
consistent
we
and
have
persistent.
different geometric systems, but they're appropriate. We have plane geometry, we have spherical geometry, and of course the rules are different. The angles add up to 180 degrees on a plane, but on a sphere they don't. But we're talking about something very different. We have, and when we want to send a rocket to the moon, we don't want to use the formulas from plane geometry because that's not the environment we're really calculating in. And I don't think this is necessarily that math itself is inconsistent, but rather that we have systems of mathematics and geometry that are suited to the context in which they are used as useful. But I don't see really a violation there, personally.
Right. I think the thing is that what we do is we bootstrap our way to
Right.
our understanding of the universe.
Yes.
And that, yes, what we will do is provisionally accept a set of axioms that describe how we think the world works. And that's just a starting point. That's to give us a framework for experimentation. And then after that, what takes over is empiricism. Because if we start seeing results that do not fit that explanation, then we discard our prior hypothesis and shift to a different one.
Right.
So in a sense, it's sort of like you're constantly inventing a hypothetical model of how the universe works that you haven't yet demonstrated yet, but it's still built on an empirical foundation. And then you go out and test it and revise it. So it's both. It's if we did not have a consistent universe, then we could not get consistent results from our axiom testing or our
And frankly,
hypothesis
we wouldn't even
testing,
have a
and
way
we
of
start to fall
knowing
apart.
that. That's the
Sure.
point I was getting at. Is
Yeah.
that if the universe wasn't consistent, we wouldn't even have a way of determining that the universe wasn't consistent.
Right, but
because-
our cell phones would stop working and our hearts would stop beating and we'd all die.
Yeah, and as far as mathematics is concerned, mathematics is something we made up. Obviously numbers in the sense that there's one apple, there's two apples, three apples. But we're taking something that we developed to keep track of how many children we have, how many animals we have, and trying to use that model to mathematically explain the universe, and it gets hard, especially if we deal with quantum physics. So that some of it doesn't work, or there may be problems with it. Well, it's something we made up in order to try to explain things. So yeah, there are times it just doesn't work.
Right. Quantum physics is actually a good example because that's something that is so non-intuitive. It's not something that we built a priori to explain a class of phenomena. It's something that we were driven to by the empirical observations. This is the model we have to use to make everything fit.
Well, here's the gospel, PZ. That is the good news. Most of the people sending in comments simply are stating that Jesus was murdered. And so most of the people commenting tonight are not suggesting that he died for our sins. And I think that's good news. What do you think?
An acceptance of reality is always good news.
People are saying, love this guy, PZ. He's awesome.
He's a rock star here tonight.
He really is.
Yeah.
You know, we have been watching some of your videos, and I'm always appalled.
I'm that bad. Okay.
No.
No.
Finish up.
Sometimes, you know, you get ever so kind, and then from time to time you'll say, you know, blank you or whatever. But that's fine. I feel like saying that sometimes myself. But I guess my point is you're extremely patient with theists. They will come at you with philosophical arguments, and you know that they're going to try to tie it to the Bible or the Quran, etc. What makes you want to confront them?
Oh, it's good for me. I mean, you know, the thing is that most theists, there's a number that I just shut out that I do not want to talk with because they're so irrational. There's no point. But I think most theists are well-meaning and really are interested in addressing the questions. So I'm happy to have a conversation with somebody who's sincere and honest about it. And also, you know, part of it is that I'm so damn confident in my own ideas that I figure I'm going to win them over.
Could it be true that you actually love theists?
I love everybody. I'm
Wow.
a humanist. I'm, you know,
Sure.
I think people are good on average, and I think even the ones who are deluded.
City no.
I need to let Vince know that we've had several people commenting on his painting. You're doing a wonderful job. A wonderful job.
Yeah, someone even said, Gray Taylor said, God-given talent, in quotes, for the artist. How is the atheist that he can have such talent if it's God-given talent? Ha ha. Excellent work by the artiste. We would like to see more. Link to his work, question mark. And even Christian said, great job by the artist. And Bob, you had a well-wisher. Tally said, well said, Bob. So you said something really good about an hour ago.
PZ, what can we do to support you? The New Covenant group really wants to support your work. We really believe in what you're doing.
Well, no, most of my work is doing biology over at the university, so there's not much you can do. This stuff that I'm talking about is stuff I do for fun, so it's not like I'm asking for people to help me out with it.
Well, I mean, you go to different places simply speaking out, and, you know, there are various things that are very, that really upset me, to say the least. We had some guests on our show here a while back, and they even interrupted my show in a very rude way, and they will go nameless, but they go from university to university to university preaching the gospel. I'm talking about preaching Jesus Christ and Him crucified. He died for your sins. Accept Him as your Lord and Savior or go to hell. And they are out there using presuppositional apologetics.
I can guess what you're talking about.
There you
You've
go.
written about them. I know this.
Yes.
What is your opinion about these guys going on to a university? I mean, they're studying science, God forbid. They're studying science, and then when they walk out of the classroom, they have to meet these presuppositional apologist. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think bring them on. No, I fully endorse having these people come onto campus. That's what we're supposed to be doing on campus, is introducing students to the real world and having the follies of the real world march on so nicely and present themselves for dissection is a really useful thing. So, no, I never discourage these people from showing up. And when they do show up on my campus, I will be there and I'll be talking to them. So I think that's a good thing.
That's wonderful.
Good job.
We applaud you for your honesty, your willingness, and your willingness to confront people. I like that style. Don't stop that.
I never will, no.
How can people get in touch with you to actually get involved in the things that you're involved in the atheistic movement?
Well,
Can I amend that question a bit and say, what is the biggest thing that you think that the secular people who want to get involved with it can be doing to help the cause as well? I mean, people like even myself, who's certainly a very small upstart compared to the Free Thought Blogs network. I mean, what can we do? Is it local community action? What do you recommend the most? What have you seen?
Yeah, Free Thought Blogs is a fun place to go and read and argue and discuss things. But where you really want to go is you want to go to the major organizations that have chapters all over the place. So I would recommend to people, Americans United for Separation of Church and State is a great organization. If you're into science education, the National Center for Science Education. If you're more of a hardcore atheist, go for American Atheists. If you're more of a humanist, you're more concerned about social justice issues and things like that, go to American Humanists. All of these organizations have newsletters that they will send out to you for free. They have magazines that you can subscribe to. They have regular conferences, both national and regional, that you can attend. And they also ask for more people to volunteer to work with them. Especially on local and regional issues. They're always looking for more people on the ground to help them out. So contact any of those organizations. They're all on the web, but they're easy to find. And you'll find lots of information on good things you can do to contribute to this cause.
We'd like
Sorry,
to thank...
Dr. Jones, if I hijacked your question there.
Oh, that's fine. Quite all right. We've enjoyed our time with you here tonight. You've been so kind and so filled full of wonderful knowledge and input.
I just like to talk, I think. That's it.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Yeah.
Any closing thoughts,
We all
PZ?
do, if you can't tell.
Gosh, I guess the theme for this evening was the reality of the crucifixion, all that stuff, and I think it's pretty clear that not only is it false, but it's a really bad philosophy. It's just sidetracked our culture for a few thousand years. It's about time we got off of it.
I agree. Well, thank you for your time tonight, and we've had a wonderful time having PZ here tonight, honey.
Yes, we did. We sure did. And everybody else really enjoys it. I mean, it's like really having a rock star in our presence. I mean, that's the way we think about it. We really do.
Yeah.
Except I'm not that musical. Sorry.
Well,
Maybe we can get you to do a show with us with Jimmy Swaggart.
that was the face you were looking for earlier.
There you go. I've been trying to get Jack Van Impe on our show, believe it or not. I mean, my wife and I love watching the guy. He talks about end time happenings and how it's just funny. It's hilarious.
New World Order.
Right.
Really big
It's
in that.
actually what we came out of, believe it or not. And so we're still on
came
this
out of it.
journey
I didn't
of
come
getting
out of that.
rescued out of religion. And so, in a sense, take the atheist prayer and pray for us. Greg Bray, you always close us out in prayer. Would you do so?
Yes, well, of course, once again, today is Mother's Day, so I want to say a special thank you to all of the mothers out there. And as always, I will close in a prayer of thanks and a prayer to those that I know actually exist. And today, especially, that goes out to mothers, but a special thank you to PZ Myers and to all the people out there who are trying to move everything forward in a way that we can come together no matter what our belief system growing up is, and try to come closer to the actual reality of truth. And through honest discourse and dialogue like we've had today, I think that I want to say thank you to all the people who have used it and more to make a difference in the world. So one final note on that is I guess this one isn't a thank you so much as just simply praise of skepticism in general, that through skepticism we can understand the world better, and it expands so much beyond just these questions and into realms of everything about our knowledge. And a special thanks to that particular philosophy, as disembodied as it may be.
Amen. Am I the only one that's going to say amen?
It looks like
Oh, I
it.
said amen.
Amen, amen.
Yeah,
Okay,
amen.
there you go. Okay, thank you guys for your time. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Ladies and gentlemen, what a day and what a night. We want to thank our special guest, PZ Myers, our panelists, Michael Fulford, Matthew Land, Sean. He's not telling his last name. We're calling him Sean. Mr. Sean. And we want to thank our hosts, our other hosts, for joining us tonight, Greg Bray and Bob Graves. If you are new to watching The Place, we are doing this every week on Sundays from 10 in the morning till 10 in the evening. We have discussions going all day long. If you missed this afternoon where Greg and I bloodied each other over the topic of whether God exists or not, you missed something really special. And all the shows that came before and after it, Reflections, Dr. Jones's own show, The Unconventional Pastor, Inspiring Honesty, What Would Love Do, and of course the greatest show of all, Matt's show and my show, The Beginnings of Greatness, which is the standard for all other shows, in case you missed that. And we also have a little short time together on Wednesday nights, so we hope that you join us every week as we all move forward together, atheists and theists together. That is the New Covenant group. Until then, we love you.